Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.' The manager said to him, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that, when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 3,000 litres of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 1,500. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 30 tons a week,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 24. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than they are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourself in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight."
Great, thanks, Lorna. If you are part of Year 7, I think you're heading out to your group, so if you'd like to do that, feel free to go now. If you've got that Bible passage open in front of you, that would be brilliant. Well, thank you for being here this morning, particularly if you're visiting with us. I hope you feel really welcomed and glad to be here. We're working our way through a section in Luke's Gospel where Jesus tells stories. We've called our series "A Sting in the Tail" because the parables, as they're known, the stories that Jesus tells, often come with a sting in the tail. They expose us. And a bit this morning we're going to be thinking, about a subject that is close to all our hearts. And I want to start by being a bit like Bilbo in the book The Hobbit and giving you a riddle to work out. So, see if you can work it out, get your brain caps on. I have two faces but cannot see. I open doors but cannot touch. I land on my tail and cannot walk, but I can vanish in a moment. What am I? A coin, money. That's the passage this morning that Jesus, in the passage this morning, Jesus addresses. He wants to talk to us about our money. In fact, in Luke's Gospel, money is a big subject. Someone has worked out that 1 in 7 verses in the Gospel of Luke are about money. Of the 39 parables that Jesus tells across the Gospels, almost a quarter of them are about money. Money is something Jesus talks about more than anything else. And so as we've been working through our parables, at some point we had to come across it. Now I want to say really clearly, if you're a visitor here and you've not been to church before, then please don't panic. Okay, there's no offering plate going to come round at the end of this talk. I do hope this service will be helpful for you in working out what church is like. We've come to a passage on money, and it's not what we talk about every week. And particularly this parable, it's difficult, isn't it? It's not a parable I would necessarily choose to preach on. There's lots in it that's slightly tricky to understand, not least because of, I think, the implications that it has for us. That said, if you are a regular here, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, and you're regularly part of church with us, I should be upfront that my prayer for all of us this week, so the application of this passage this week, is that we would give away lots of our money. Because I think that's what Jesus is calling us to. So brace yourselves if you're a follower of Jesus. I think that's what God has for us as we look at this. See, Luke has gathered together Jesus' stories and he's arranged them carefully. And in this sort of section, Jesus has been teaching about his kingdom priorities. All the way back in chapter 13, Jesus is asked the question. The question is, will those who are saved be few? And in response, Jesus starts a block of teaching answering that question. And we've seen it over the last few weeks. We saw it back in when we looked at chapter 14, where Jesus talks about a great banquet that's coming. That heaven will be filled, absolutely, but it won't be filled with the people you expect it to be filled with. It'll be filled with the unclean, the outsiders, not those who assume that they're in. And then a couple of weeks back, Dave took us through chapter 15, where you got the three parables of the lost things, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost sons. And Jesus' teaching there is aimed at the grumbling Pharisees who don't like the fact that he's hanging around with tax collectors and sinners. And he says, look, the reason I'm with these people is because that's why I've come. I'm the shepherd who's come to seek and to save the lost. I'm the true older brother who's come to bring back the lost sons. I'm the one who's gone out looking for the coin and the sheep. And heaven rejoices with me. And notice chapter 16, verse 1. This is actually a parable that's part of those three. We sometimes just preach on chapter 15 and leave it there. But in the original language, verse 1 of chapter 16 starts with, and also Jesus said to his disciples. This is part of those stories. This is not a new block of teaching. So that's the context of what's going on. And the first thing that Jesus sort of says in this parable is, certainty about tomorrow shapes today. That's the big point, I think, in verses 1 to 8. For all that's strange and isn't straightforward about the parable, I think the big idea is fairly easy to get, isn't it? Now, the Bible, I should say, if you're a visitor, the Bible isn't an easy book. God is really clear about what he wants to say. That doesn't mean it's always easy to get hold of it. We have to do some work and reflect on what it says. And I think as you reflect on this parable, and feel free to obviously to do that later off the back of what I said, the big idea is that it's wise to act in the present in light of what's going to happen in the future. And so Jesus tells a parable, verses 1 and 2, a manager who's not very good at managing the master's possessions is called into the office and is fired. So you can imagine the scene. Lord Sugar calls in his new apprentice into the boardroom, doesn't he? And he runs through all the ways in which he's wasted his possessions, how he's let him down, how he's perhaps acted dishonourably, and, well, he's fired. He's given his notice. That's it. The business world is closed for him. The job's gone. Reputation is in ruins. There's no chance of a good reference for the next money-lending master. And he says he's not very good at manual labour. He's got arms like Johnny Gilkison. Can't really dig very well. That was a joke for those of you who knew. You can laugh. And he's not willing to beg. So instead, he comes up with a cunning plan as he works his notice. I haven't got my phone with me, but that's good, I guess. But he picks up his phone, doesn't he? And he starts making calls to the clients of his master. He says, hi, Roger. I'm just calling about the money that you owe. Yeah, you know the money you owe. Well, it's now time to settle the invoice. And you know what? If we can settle it today, if we can sort out a transfer today, I'm prepared to move the 100 grand down to 50 grand. Would that be okay with you if we can settle it today? Yeah, I know it's generous, but we just want to get things sorted. Great, thanks. And then he picks up the phone again and he says, Cheryl, like your credit card bill is due, it's 30 grand. Yeah, that's right. Well, a special offer, if you can reduce it today, if you can clear it today, let's just call it 20. Is that all right with you? Yes, I know it's generous, but the lower the price, the lower the hassle. So let's just get it sorted. And so it goes on. Here's the manager doing what he can to secure his future, investing, the parable says, in friends to take care of him, so that once the money stops rolling in through the paycheck, he's got contacts on the outside. Now, I should say that there is a bit of debate about this parable, as you perhaps can imagine, as to what the manager is actually doing. Is he really being dishonest here, or is the dishonesty about verses 1 and 2 that the master calls him out for? So it could be that the manager here is just sort of removing the interest on the loans, some of which would have gone into his pocket as payment, and perhaps even illegal interest, some have suggested, and that's what he's removing to settle the debt to earn friends in the future. He's not really being dishonest. It could be that, or it could be that he's wasting his master's possessions in order to sort out friendship in the future. There's debate about what's going on. And really the debate is caused because why does the master seem to commend him? Like, what's going on there? And we could talk about that if you're interested afterwards. Is he fleecing the master, or is he just being clever? Well, whatever the actual situation is in the story, the big point is not that he's commended for being dishonest, if that's what he's doing, is he? He clearly gets the sack for not being great at his job. No, he's commended for his shrewdness. It's commendable, says Jesus, to act in the presence, to act in the present in the light of something that you know about in the future. That's Jesus' point. He's not saying it's good to be dishonest. That's not the argument. He's not saying that we should be like those investors in the oil trade this week who it looks like had some insider knowledge about one of Trump's tweets and say invested wisely to gain millions. He's not saying act illegally. No, Jesus is using a lesser to greater argument, isn't he? He's saying, look, if people around you can can act in the present to shape certainty about the future because of what they know, then how much more should you? How much more those who know that the great banquet is coming, chapter 14. How much those who know that life is about the party that God's going to welcome sinners into, that we see in chapter 15. If you have certainty about the future, says Jesus, well then it should show itself in the present. Be more shrewd than the world is with the money that they've got. Now, I think we know that kind of logic. We act on that all the time. That's how your pension works if you have one, isn't it? I know that at some point the salary will stop, so I'll invest wisely now. Or I know I've got exams coming, so I better work hard at revising in order to, get through those. And that's Jesus' point. It's commendable to act in the present in the light of the future. And so Jesus applies it, doesn't he? In verses 9 to 12, when heaven is certain, he says, give money today. That's the point in verses 9 to 12. Let me read it to us again. I tell you, said Jesus, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've been trustworthy with someone else's property, if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Now, let me just clear something up that might be confusing in some Bible translations. When Jesus talks about worldly wealth, or if you've got a slightly different translation, it might say unrighteous wealth or something like that. It's not talking about worldly or unrighteous as though money is a bad thing. The literal word is mammon, which just means possessions or cash or investments. So it's not worldly wealth as in bad wealth. It just means wealth that belongs to this world. It won't be useful to you in the world to come. I am not a huge fan of board games. I think there's much better things you can do with your time. But I used to enjoy playing Monopoly as a kid, particularly. I used to love it at the start of the game when you got sort of the large sort of wad of cash in your hand. And I remember being sort of 5 or 6 and thinking, man, I'm so rich. Look at like these 500 Monopoly pound notes or whatever it was. But imagine I sort of took that into everyday life now, and I head to the petrol station with the extortionate prices they are at the minute, and fill the tank up, and then I hand over my large wad of Monopoly money. Start boastfully sort of laying out the cash. The response I'm going to get is, what have you brought that for? That's no good here. See, Jesus' point is turning up to heaven with a wallet full of cash. Same response. But why have you brought that? That's not the currency we use here. He's talking about worldly wealth, but how do we use the stuff that we have now in the light of the future? Second question we need to clear up is, who does he mean by friends? Like, what is he talking about? Well, here's where the context, I think, comes in. Remember, Luke has carefully arranged his material. That's what he says back in chapter 1. And chapter 16 comes right after chapter 14 and 15, chapters 14 and 15. Parables about getting people who into the kingdom who you don't expect to be there. So the waifs and strays of chapter 14, who are from the highways and byways, who are brought in to the banquet. The coin, the sheep, and particularly the lost son who heads off to a far country and is welcomed back into the kingdom. 3 parables that Jesus tells, particularly in chapter 15, about why it is that he's hanging around with tax collectors and sinners. Because he's seeking and saving the lost. And so when chapter 16 starts with, and also Jesus said this to his disciples, we should be thinking about those stories. So who are the friends who will welcome you into eternal dwellings? Well, it's the people who've become followers of Jesus and part of his kingdom because of the work and the investment that we've made now. That's the point. That's Jesus' point. If you know heaven's coming, give money to the kingdom now. Invest in those kinds of friends. Some of you might have heard of a businessman called Lang. Back in the mid-20th century, he set up a construction company and is one of the companies, well, it was the company really, that built the M1 motorway. Made loads and loads of money out of construction. But the way Lang set up his business was that he made sure the majority of his profits were reinvested into gospel ministry. And that the profits still to this day go into a trust that gives away profits in order to fund churches and Bible colleges and missionaries and all sorts of things. It's reckoned that UCCF, for example, exists today in the way that it does, predominantly because of the Lang legacy. It's reckoned that Lang and his businesses in the last however many decades have given up to about £500 million away to churches, missions and all sorts of gospel projects. And when Lang died, in his bank account there was £371. It's impressive to meet people like that, isn't it? Who've got such a vision for the kingdom that they use what they have and invest it in the kingdom. Or more closer to home, I remember being sat in the school that my daughter now goes to when Cornerstone used to meet there. Cornerstone's the big church near Sainsbury's on Castle Marina. And I remember Peter Lewis, who's passed away since, but I remember him saying to his congregation, we're going to build a building by Castle Marina, And it's going to need every member of Cornerstone to give around £10,000 each. And I remember him saying to his congregation, some of you are going to need a new car in the next 10 years. Some of you are going to need extensions on your houses and all the rest of it. Well, why not stop doing that and give to this instead? And that church wonderfully raised, I think it was close to 3.5 million as a membership of just 400 at the time. Amazing vision of how can we serve the gospel in our city and give generously. And notice, look down at verses 10 to 12 with me, to turn the page for that, but look down at 10 to 12. And notice Jesus' point. This is not just a parable for those who've got large investments and bank balances and really good salaries, is it? This is not aimed, he's not targeting the rich here. He's targeting all of us. Remember, the disciples who he's speaking to are those who have left everything to follow him. They've left their businesses and their families and following Jesus. Now look at verses 10 to 12. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? You see Jesus' point. His assumption to his disciples following him is that the possessions that each of them have, the wealth that they have, doesn't actually belong to them. It's been entrusted to them. In other words, the disciples are like the manager of verses 1 and 2, aren't they? Entrusted from the master with a certain amount of wealth. Possessions are theirs on trust. And so, how will they use them? Will they be trustworthy? The disciples then are to use their earthly wealth that's been entrusted to them to gain friends for eternity. Investing in what will actually last. See, it's not about the amount that you start with in the bank. That's not Jesus' point. But how shrewd are you with what you do have? And are you investing in heaven? In Jesus' kingdom? That's Jesus' point. With the certainty of heaven, use the money God has loaned you for friends in heaven. I remember a few years ago now, many years ago, in fact, someone saying this to me when we were talking about money. And I was sort of asking the question, I think, like, how much should I give away? And his response was, well, think of it, change how you think. It's not so much how much of your money should you give away, but how much of God's money that is entrusted to you do you need? I just find it very challenging. It's always exposing when I think of that. That's Jesus' point here, isn't it? Use what you have now to fill heaven with sinners who are rescued by Jesus. See, if this world is all that there is, and that might be what some of you believe this morning, then this is ridiculous. Like, you've got to protect it. You've got to spend it today. You've got to, leisure, pleasure, treasure, just go for it. If this world is all that there is. But if Jesus is onto something, and I suspect we think he is, then it has implications, doesn't it? And that's his final point. Here's the sting in the tail in verse 13. Look down at that with me. You can't serve God with money. Here's the sting in the tail. You can't serve both God and money. And so the question for us this morning is, how do you know if you're serving money? Well, look down at verse 14. Here's how the Pharisees react. The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. That's how you know. How you respond to a talk like this. That's how you know where your heart is. See, all these things that the Pharisees have heard is not just this parable. They've heard the lost sons, the lost sheep, the lost coin. They've heard about the great banquet. and the waifs and strays, and how the kingdom will be filled with people that you don't expect to be there. And their response was first grumbling, and now it's, you are ridiculous. What a stupid way to live. That's how we know. It's how we react to what Jesus says. What's going on right now in your heart? When you hear Jesus say, invest in making friends in heaven, friends for heaven, like, how do you respond to that? See, if Jesus, who he claims to be, who we've sung about him being our only hope in life and death, that's what we've sung, then that, Jesus says, will show itself in your bank balance and in your spending habits. Now, let me say again, if you're a visitor this morning, we're not passing a plate round. To come to church is free. It's a wonderful thing. The gospel is free, lavishly so. And you need to hear, if this is you need to hear what Jesus is saying about himself. Like, he's sort of the shrewd manager par excellence, isn't he? Like, he came into the world, Paul says, and became poor so that others might become rich. He came to give his life as a ransom for many, to pay the debt that we all owe, so that we will be his friends on the day of judgment, that will join him in his heavenly banquet. He gave everything, and read on in Luke's gospel, and it really does give everything. His own life, he lays it down for sinners. Like, he's not asking us to do anything that he's not prepared or hasn't already done in himself. And if you're a visitor, you need to know that's who the God of the universe is. That's what he's like. He doesn't say, give me your money so you can have a place in heaven. That's not the parable. No, he's done everything to get you there himself. Now, the parable is for those that trust him already, who see that and think, I want to be just like him. So do you think heaven is certain this morning? Are you persuaded that God's great priority is to seek and to save the lost? Do you believe that your possessions won't go with you into the next life? There's a story told of a billionaire who died, and around his graveside someone said, well, how much did he leave? And to which a guy responded, well, he left everything. That's the reality of our monopoly money of this world. You see, if you believe those things, Jesus says, if you're with me in my kingdom, then you'll invest in friends for heaven, and it'll be obvious in your bank balance. Even the dishonest manager's lifestyle showed that when he knew the future, it changed his habits in the present. So what about us this morning? Now, we often talk about having someone we're accountable to for our internet habits, don't we? Someone who will check our history to make sure, we're following Jesus in a purity way. But what about our bank statements? You're willing to hand that over to someone and just say, would you read through that and say, like, where are my priorities? If you're anything like me, that is the last thing you're willing to do. Don't worry, we're not going to make that mandatory for church membership. But feel the sting in the tail. Do you feel it? Do you feel Jesus' exposing words just pulling our hearts away and what are you after? Jesus came seeking and saving the lost, and he calls us to join him on that mission. I wonder if you could imagine that final day when you meet Jesus. Then you walk through the pearly gates, if there are pearly gates. I'm not persuaded there will be. But as you walk through, you just keep hearing people saying, oh, I'm so glad you're here. You know the money you gave to Bible translation all those years ago? Like, it meant that me and my family heard about Jesus, and that's why we're here. You remember that money you gave to that building project? Well, that resulted in this whole generation of a family becoming missionaries over in this, and this whole group of people have heard the gospel that didn't know it, and thank you for your generosity. What would that be like on that final day? That's what Jesus is calling us to. You might want to talk to someone about this. There's a couple of questions on the screen for after the service. I think this would be a great question to talk with a close friend. Maybe if you're married, this would be an interesting conversation over dinner once the kids are finally in bed. Like, what, do we serve a God who welcomes sinners? Is that what's going on in my life? And then what would show us if that was true, particularly with regards to our money? We need to stop. Let me lead us in a prayer. If the band wants to come up, that would be brilliant. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Lord Jesus, we confess as we read these words, our minds are filled with, yeah, but what about? We recognise there's much in your word that doesn't, we're not called to give everything away and live poor lives. Possessions are good gifts from you that we're to enjoy. But please help us to not fill our minds with the yeah but to hear the sting in the tale of this parable. And to really wrestle with what you say to us here. Help us to see just how generous you've been with all that was yours as you for our sake became poor, so that we through your poverty might become rich. Thank you that you've emptied heaven for us, that we might be your friends. And please would you help us to see how we might join you in your mission of seeking and saving the lost, with our possessions, with our time, resources, whatever it is. And ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.